Here we are at the end of the Rings of Power Season 2. There are 5 storylines, really scrunched. Probably would have been better if they just focused on Numenor, Eregion, and the Dwarves. This is a longer episode, so if you want to just jump to one of the storylines or a particular point in the review, then go to the chapters, which are in the description. I'll be joined by my co-host Mark, along with my returning guests Jared and Nathan, and my new guest Maverick Dickson from a Lost Plot podcast. Some highlights are Adar and the healing power of the Elven Rings, the late appearance of the Dwarves, and Tolkien and Amazon's conflicting worldviews. Oh, and remember to like and subscribe. With that, let's dive right in. Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today I have with me here my co-host Mark, along with 2 returning guests, Nathan and Jared. And then a new guest we have with us, Maverick Dickson from a Lost Plot podcast. So thanks for joining us, Maverick. And just because I do this with every new guest, I'll just ask quick, what got you into Lord of the Rings? As a fan, was it just watching the movies or reading the books or...
Yeah, I mean, as much as I'm more of a cinema guy in general, my family's been big into this stuff for years and years. My dad made us all read the books before we watched the movies, that stereotypical thing. And then from there, I read some of the other ancillary works where I read, the Silmarillion, the Children of Hurin, the Book of Lost Tales, Book of Lost Tales 2, and Bay of Belfalas is the furthest I got in regards to lore type stuff. And that was a while ago, so I don't remember all of it, but I've been, pretty big fan of the content as a whole and love the works. Tolkien's world building is phenomenal. It's inspirational, especially for someone who loves storytelling and wants to tell stories myself. It's definitely a high bar to try to reach for when it comes to what is great storytelling. So that's my background in regards to this content. And it's always exciting to talk about it and think about it and talk about what is so great about it,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I forgot to mention that today we're going to be reviewing the Rings of Power Season 2, Episode 8. So it's the last episode of this season, which has had its up and downs, definitely. But I think it'll be cool to get into. So, all right. So with this, we've got 5 different storylines. We got the Dwarves, we got the Elves, we got Numenor, we got the Stranger and Harfoots, and we have Isildur and his little crowd. So, Jared, start us off with giving a breakdown of the Dwarves and maybe give us some lore accuracy or inaccuracy that you see there.
Yeah, so to start off the episode, we had a pretty epic, intense opening scene with Durin III, Durin the Elder, current king of Moria, delving deeper into the mine. His son Durin IV, Durin the Younger, is trying to stop him, but his father breaks through and uncovers a cavern full of mithril, showing his son the true wealth of the mountain. But in the moment of their kind of triumph and connection, unfortunately, a Balrog of Morgoth shows up. And Durin III kind of realizes in a moment the error of his ways, and he takes off his ring and goes to fight the Balrog to give his son time to chance to escape. And then afterwards, closer to the end of the episode, we see that the dwarves are in mourning, and as they're mourning the loss of their current king, Durin IV's legitimacy as heir is being questioned. They think that several other dwarf lords, including Durin IV's brother, might actually be the preferred heir. So, yeah, that's just the basic rundown of what happens in the dwarf plotline for the episode. As regarding lore accuracy, that's where it gets a little bit trickier. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the opening scene. I think it's incredible, just from purely nerd point of view. Just seeing a dwarf fight a Balrog was just chef's kiss, so good. But yeah, if we're going to go with lore accuracy, things play out a little bit differently. So we've talked a bit about this before on the podcast, me and Philip. We talked about timeline compression. I think it's a good thing, but it also can be a little bit of a tricky, messy thing. It's a bit of a Pandora's box. And I think that kind of shows here. So the Balrog in lore doesn't show up until about halfway through the Third Age. So about 1,500, 600 years in the future. And it actually doesn't kill during the Third, it kills during the Sixth. He's the king of Khazad-dûm at that time. And afterwards, the dwarves flee and find Erebor in the Grey Mountains. But, so having the Balrog show up in the Second Age as a result directly of the rings, I think was an interesting choice. I like how they tied it into the ring storyline. Like the ring is what made the dwarves delve too greedily and too deeply into Khazad-dûm. I think that was an interesting choice. And of course, the scene with Durin sacrificing himself for his son, I think that kind of like brought his character arc to a nice close of the season so far. It was a little rushed, but having that moment was pretty cool. But it does open up a can of worms as to like what are the dwarves going to do now, and it's not something that's really addressed again in the episode. So obviously the dwarves at the end of the episode, obviously they're mourning their king, but they don't mention that there is still a Balrog like a few stories underneath their feet. And I think that's kind of the problem with having the bit of a timeline compression. I read an interview with the showrunners, and they said that they like the idea of a Balrog being kind of a progressive generational type curse for the dwarves. I can kind of see where they're coming from with that, but I still think that like logistically it's a little strange because like the fall of Khazad-dûm was one giant, insane, tragic event in the Third Age. I actually originally thought that they were just going to have the dwarves flee Khazad-dûm in this episode. That's what I was kind of thinking was going to happen. So the fact that like it didn't happen is like a little strange. I hope we maybe get a little bit more about how they feel about a Balrog underneath them in their basement at this point in the next season. But yeah, and other than that, with the plot line that they're teasing for season 3 about Durin and his brother, that's actually something that's neither in the like it goes against the lore or is with the lore, because we don't really know anything about Durin the Fourth or like anything with his brothers, but we do know that succession is a big thing in the Dwarven kingdoms. So seeing some kind of like political thing happening there would be pretty cool for the next season's plotline. But that's all I got to say. If anyone wants to add.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, that was like the big thing. That was like one of the big things in The Hobbit, were like, who is the right person to inherit the Lonely Mountain and all that stuff. So
yeah, it's a huge thing for the dwarves.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think we're going to see the Balrog again, or do you think it's just going to be like teased like the Entwives and then just never seen from again?
I don't know. I kind of hope so. I mean, if they're gonna bring in the Balrog, if they don't have like if they're gonna go that route, they kind of need to go all the way, in my opinion. Like maybe in the last season have Khazad-dûm fall or something, because I feel like just having the Balrog show up just this once and then like a brief second last season would be like kind of unfulfilled kind of promise. So I hope it shows up again. I think it would make story sense if it did. Like if you have the dwarves being displaced in the last season, I think you could do something with that story wise. But yeah, I don't know.
Anything, Mark, with like the compression or anything else on your line about that?
Well, I was going to say it's really interesting that they have the Balrog being a generational curse. That's actually like the role that the 7 Dwarven rings were supposed to play, is that they gave the dwarves incredible wealth, but over time they would actually have curses associated with them. So it's interesting that they really, the timeline compression means that they played off the rings very differently, where the ring was totally evil, and now they're going to play the Balrog as like a generational curse. So it's sort of them flipping the script. And I think the one thing that you sort of lose in that is like the Balrog seems very much less intimidating. Like I thought, like you, that instantly they'd have to clear out of, Khazad-dûm, that instantly would sort of turn the tables. And it seems like everything's just going back to status quo. And that's like, it sort of doesn't set up the Balrog as the threat that it was meant to be.
Yeah, I feel like just having some sort of discussion about like it still being there was kind of necessary to like have more of the stakes. Because like, this is a demon of the ancient world. This is like bad news. Like, I feel like it should be weighing a little more heavily on their minds.
I think it's especially relevant from what we're going to see later in the same episode, where you go, they did not send out the army because Durin the Third was going down to dig in the mountain, and it was because they were afraid of some unknown terror that was down there. And now that that terror is manifest, now we feel okay with sending out our forces instead of keeping them here to protect against this evil. It seems less than logically consistent to do that as the new leader of the kingdom. I mean, yeah. That being said, I do agree that that scene is pretty awesome. Like, this is one of the plot lines that I think out of all of them is more cohesive and more progressively like intriguing. You know, I think that the dwarven side had some really good like tension between Durin the Third and Durin the Fourth and things like that. So overall, I don't have problems with it. But this, because the dwarves coming to the aid later in the episode is so critical to their survival, the elf survival. Not to get too far ahead, but like I think it's important to note, like, does that actually make sense from a storyline progression? And I think based off of the stakes they provided, the fears of this unknown danger, it doesn't.
Yeah. What I will say for what I could give as a plain devil's advocate right now is like when you see the scene when he goes through the epic clash, the explosion happens when the cave-in happens. So like, unless like somebody could like sense if the evil's still there, they may have thought, oh, my father sacrificed himself and he, you know, they took the demon down with him. And so then they're like, oh, okay, the king sacrificed himself in his last moments. We don't have to worry about this because his sacrifice was there. So we're good to go try to save the elves. That's the only thing I can think of, but it's still kind of weak.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think that
like a Balrog does not die to one axe.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that goes back to Jared's point that like that might be accurate, but they should at least have some conversation around that to indicate that rather than just having it happen and then moving on.
Yeah, it's very, very kind of typical of the show to almost have these like compressed moments that would be really cool if they would have fleshed them out, but instead like they kind of just sped over them, and then anybody who's watching is like, oh, okay, well now we're on to the next thing. Where it kind of been nice to get like an idea of how they move from here to there, because I mean like the dwarves at the end, in my opinion, was like, oh, okay, like they finally like they showed up like all of a sudden, you know?
Yeah, I don't want to get like too broad here just yet, but like I think that when it comes to anything Lord of the Rings in a visual medium, I want to know what deleted scenes there were of this episode, because I think that deleted scenes are an adaptation's greatest enemy when it comes to Lord of the Rings. Because if you watch like Return of the King without the extended edition scenes, it's a very different kind of vibe. So I think that, I don't know if there were any deleted scenes, like maybe what we're talking about actually was a deleted scene and they cut it for time's sake, which I think would not have been a good idea. Like I would have been perfectly happy with an hour and a half long finale. I would have gladly taken the extra 20 minutes for like things to breathe a little bit more.
So do we want to discuss the elves next then?
Yes, yeah, let's go on to the elves. So Mark, you want to give us a little bit of a breakdown on that one?
So this was like the fall of Eregion. We see the final moments of Celebrimbor and his interplay with Sauron. Sauron takes over the Orcs and convinces them to turn on an Adar and kill Adar. Then he has a final duel with Galadriel, and the dwarves show up to see the rest of the elves, and the elves manage to escape. And through it, Sauron gains the 9 rings, and Galadriel saves her ring, and Elrond uses the ring, and so it's like sort of his big arc as, you know, learning to accept the rings for what they were. So to go off right off the bat, lore accuracies and inaccuracies, I mean, clearly Eregion does fall in the books, and there's a lot of lore accuracies in that the dwarves do end up coming to save the elves, and especially Elrond, from dying, and are able to sort of prevent Sauron from just completely winning the day. The whole interplay with the way the 9 rings works is lore inaccurate, but that's just because they made the rings in the wrong order in the show as opposed to the books. So Sauron ends up taking the 16 rings, and he convinces Celebrimbor to tell him where they are, but the 3 rings are not even in the area at that point, and so they're not under threat. I think the highlight for lore accuracies was Celebrimbor's final moments with Sauron. So Celebrimbor is in the books tortured by Sauron, and then he is hung on a staff with like his body with a bunch of arrows in it. So that like is very lore accurate, but also just whenever people die in Tolkien's mythology, they tend to have like these far-reaching visions. It happens all the time, and so Celebrimbor sort of says, ring will be your downfall, sort of like the best kind of like foreshadowing, and also he proclaims Sauron Lord of the Rings. So that was, I think, the most lore accurate part, in my opinion. The biggest inaccuracy to me, and this is also just coming from like what I don't like about the show, is that the battle between like Galadriel and Sauron, it felt like there's two people sword fighting and not like the paragon of good and evil. And it had Halbrand show up again, and there was like that weird romancy thing in the first season, which I absolutely hated. And I was like, I hope we never see this again after this, and that Galadriel and Sauron are just like bitter enemies from this point on, and no more of this like messing with each other's mind. But yeah, I was gonna say that I think almost every single storyline we can say like had one shining lore moment, and also had like some of the problems that have plagued the show also show up in every storyline. I think in the Khazad-dûm storyline, it's like that great moment of the Balrog fighting the dwarf and the father-son, deep dwarf relationships, and some of the like the timeline compression. And this part of the show, I think it's the mixing up the rings, and the rings are like now the 9 are like the pinnacle of the craft, and the way that they're sort of like just MacGuffins at this point is something I really didn't like, but I love that Celebrimbor Sauron moment as well.
Can I ask a question of Mark?
Yeah, go for it.
So I know like in that whole interplay that you were talking about between Sauron and Galadriel, you have that situation where he once again like offers that temptation of being a queen. I didn't get any take specifically on when that was first introduced, but then having that reintroduced, I'm really curious what your thoughts are on that, especially because as a more casual viewer, right, I saw that and saw Lord of the Rings and went, oh, that was kind of a cool reference. That was a cool to see. Okay, this is something that was seeded in her mind from the beginning of the Rings. Like, what is your thoughts as like more of a huge fan of the actual accuracy of this content?
Yeah, so I think this stems from my like idea of the show that like there needs to be more magic in the show, but that like Galadriel is a person who's magical, and the rings aren't what make people magical. They already have power, and the ring grants them more power. So the idea in the show is that, in the lore, is that Galadriel actually could have beaten Sauron, right? That she actually is nearly as powerful as him, and if she had taken the ring, she could have beaten him. And the show, they've tried to play this like almost romance, semi like, oh, we could be a king and a queen together. And it was always like, no, in place of the Dark Lord, you'll have a queen, because I'm going to like destroy Sauron if I get the One Ring, because that's how powerful I am. And yeah, just that weird romance from the first season of the show, I think, is coming back. Yeah, the idea is that Sauron should theoretically be opposed to Sauron. And of all the people in Tolkien's lore, Galadriel was never fooled by Sauron like other elves were, specifically Celebrimbor. So, yeah.
Yeah, to add on to that briefly, because like I kind of agree with you, Mark. Just like I Galadriel's journey through the show has been something pretty interesting. I think you can safely say controversial, but like I think there was a few moments in the final fight that I like, and it was actually where they were talking to each other and not fighting, because they do actually briefly reference the Fellowship of the Ring at one point. So Galadriel says to Frodo, I say to you, Frodo, that even as I speak to you, I perceive the Dark Lord and know his mind, or all of his mind that concerns the elves. And he gropes ever to see me and my thought, but the door is closed. And I kind of think that's where they got like the door is shut kind of line from the show. And I liked that kind of like nod. And I think that was like an interesting thing. But I totally agree that like the whole idea of like the kind of weird romance kind of attraction, I think they're trying to leave it open to interpretation, but I don't even want it left open to interpretation. So I like totally get where you're coming from on that, and I think that like they kind like I like what they do it up to like a halfway point, and then I like drop off.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think you can really see that like Galadriel's supposed to be the paragon of like good, and I hope that's like what she's becoming. It seems like maybe that's how they'll play her on in future seasons. But yeah. I just really didn't like seeing Halbrand again, but yeah. I guess we should talk a little bit about like Adar, the betrayal stuff, and like now that Adar is dead, what we think of that, and him as a character in general as well.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I guess like one thing with that, I think the bigger the bigger part was that they showed him with the ring, right? Because he got the ring from Elrond in the previous episode, and then he put it on. It's like, thoughts about that, Mark, Jared? It's like, because I know the elves kept the 3 like really secret for a long time. So for like somebody from like basically the other side to be able to like take one is an interesting way to do it.
Can I like get a question real quick? I didn't see the episodes where you guys talked about Adar. I don't know if you need to cut this part out or not, but like, could somebody give me like the lore reference for him? Is he actually a character in the lore? Is he not? Or is he just someone that like what the background would that would be?
Go for it, Jared.
Yeah, go for it, Jared.
Okay, yeah. So Tolkien Tolkien really struggled with the idea of the orcs in his lore. It was posed a huge philosophical problem for him. So he went back and forth on how the orcs began multiple times. In one version of the story, which is the version that's published in the Silmarillion, it's strongly suggested that several elves at the very beginning of the First Age were taken by the enemy Morgoth and tortured and transformed into the first orcs. We never got like any sort of name for those, but the show expands on that idea by creating Adar as being one of 13, like the original 13 elves turned orcs. And so that's why they call him Lord Adar or Lord Father. So he's like the father of many orcs. So yeah, like with him getting the ring, I'll admit I was going back and forth on that. I mean, when you think about it, I guess that Gandalf isn't an elf and he has one of the 3 elven rings for several thousand years. So, I mean, I guess like it's not as big of a deal. I like the idea of it healing Adar. As they showed in the episode, like it healed the scars and it kind of made him more into an elf. I thought that was an interesting kind of like story thing. I'm still just not sure how I feel about Adar overall. I think he's very interesting. I just don't know if I necessarily wanted him in this show. I feel like they gave him apparently actually the showrunner said that Simon Tolkien told them to continue Adar's storyline longer. They were apparently planning to kill him off earlier in season 2. And Simon Tolkien suggested that they extend his story, which, I mean, if Simon Tolkien says it's okay, then like, yeah, but like, I just don't know how I feel about it overall. I think it had some really interesting things going for it, but I don't know, I don't know. I had mixed feelings.
Something we talk about later too is like, do we really respect Simon Tolkien?
Okay, just so I'm clear, Simon Tolkien's the grandson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's Christopher Tolkien's son, I believe. Yeah. Anyways, but we can think about it later. So
Yeah, sounds good. I was really going to quick throw on Adar that I think like in this episode you had like no one is too far from redemption. So like right at the end he's like, I'm going to join you. We're going to go back. At the same time, like that's always the problem in Tolkien's lore is that like Tolkien believes no one is too far from redemption. Therefore, what do we do about the orcs? But at the same time, like the orcs are evil. They're always evil. They're always loving bad. It's not Sauron that makes them bad. Orcs are just bad is sort of like the idea in Tolkien's lore. So yeah, I kind of liked the character of Adar, particularly because it wasn't like anything canon, but also like, yeah, no one is too far from redemption. So yeah, I guess I wasn't too down on it. I do also like how Sauron took over, though. I guess one thing that I've really struggled with in the entire second and first season is like Sauron always gets lucky. It's like this evil serendipity that follows him, and it's like, oh, while he sowed the seeds in Adar's mind, it's like, wow, things played out really great for him there in the end. And that's not really the feel you get of Sauron in the book. It's always that he's inevitable, that he's overwhelmingly powerful, that he's crafty, and that he plays his enemies off against each other. But also that he has like backup plans for backup plans. It's very unclear of like what Sauron would have done if Adar had been like not throwing his orcs into the meat grinder. I don't know. That was sort of like, I guess I wasn't like too much of a fan of that. But yeah,
I will admit I was really worried at one point in the episode where the orcs were like coming up to Sauron and they were like, the dwarves are about to overrun us. And I was really worried for a hot second. I was like, please don't make Sauron sentimental towards the orcs. Because like, that is not Sauron's thing. And then he like kills the orc immediately. And I was like, oh, that worry is moot now. So
that orc had a family.
Yeah, I agree. I think also, like, because the orcs were kind of shown to be a little more, like, relatable almost. Whenever you see them, like, coming on Eregion even, you don't get this sense of, like, "Oh, no, like, this is really, like, it for, like, Eregion." Like, you got all these orcs who are just gonna come in and, like, kill and destroy everything. You know, it's kinda like I just felt like more of this sense of, oh, like, maybe hope isn't all entirely lost if, like, the orcs maybe can kinda be good. That's just kinda my idea.
Well, they didn't kill like Elrond and Gilgalad, despite the fact that they had them captured. I don't know why they didn't do that. That was super unclear.
Right. Well, that what's true, though, is that it was Sauron who told the orcs to go back, and I actually, like, didn't catch it except for, like, the second time I watched it, and he said, like, you know, "Keep
the
all
leaders
the
alive,
leaders
right.
alive."
Yes,
Because
Yeah.
you can't take rings off of dead bodies for some reason.
Right. But I will have to say, though, is that at the end, where the elves are all gathered together, I don't know where they're supposed to be.
That is Rivendell.
Yeah,
You-
I believe it's supposed to be Rivendell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I kind of, like, assume that maybe it was, but it's, like, maybe it's a tiny fact that a lot of people didn't get bugged by, but I'm a really big, like, sword and weapon, like, person for, like, Lord of the Rings. I think that's, like, really cool. So, like, the fact that Gil-galad didn't have his, like, glaive there at the end,
Aeglos,
and he was
yeah.
pulling a sword, like, no, man, give me the glaive. So, but that's probably the only other thing that I really bothered me. But
Yeah, I forgot to mention that, but that actually is lore accurate. That on the flight from the Fall of Eregion, they find Rivendell, and it's Elrond who finds it, and that's like where he founds Rivendell afterwards. So yeah,
yeah,
Elrond is like my favorite character ever, so I was like pumping my fist in the air during that part. I wish they had actually like said like the Valley of Imladris or something at that point to like let the casual viewer, like the audience, kind of know that it's going to be Rivendell. Because my mom was like watching it with me, and she was like, "What's that place?" I had to like explain.
Yeah, I hope they bring that up in season 3 of like, that's like one of the first things is like, you know, Gil-galad goes back to Lindor and he says, Elrond, hey, help the refugees build up this place. And then Elrond's like, what are you going to call it? And he'll drop the name, whatever. Either the Elven name or the common tongue name. So,
yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next
Before we
story here.
move on, just one thing I wanted to say about Adar, not more from like a storytelling perspective that I think was a unique add-on is, and I think this goes off of what Mark was saying, is that, you know, the orcs are generally portrayed as completely evil, right? And that's maybe one of the more interesting things about this show is that it tries to show a potential other side. From a storytelling perspective, I think it was a unique add with Adar where he provided maybe an opportunity of like good and evil to ally against a greater evil, which creates a, you know, a unique moral dilemma, right? Do you as good ally with evil for the sake of destroying something worse? And as a viewer, I was almost hoping to see that from like a this would have made things more in conflict. There could have been potential for backstabs later on or some other issue. But yeah, ultimately that gets fallen short with Adar when he gets massacred by his own group, which I don't think was unfitting for his character as an end, but it definitely means that potential for like in regards to adding conflict to the story, keeping people invested, saying, okay, what's going to happen next? They definitely lost potential on that point. And then also just a slight pet peeve. Who's the black elf that shows up? I still don't understand how he like survived the double stab from Adar. And I've been personally hoping for this guy to just get massacred this entire season. And the fact that he like walks away from that, I'm still not even sure. Like, I don't know what happened, but yeah, that just is there.
I mean, you kind of saw it with Galadriel. I mean, she gets stabbed by Morgoth's clown. I mean, it does take the two, you know, it does take Gil-galad and Elrond to heal her, but, you know, elves are made of very, you know, stern stuff.
So this is the wood breastplate he had.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My bad.
It's special one. It's special.
Probably came from an
wood.
ent.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, no, the other thing I'll just say before we go on to the next storyline is what I did appreciate is like the kind of like for just the story wise is like we started in episode 1, we started with the scene with Sauron and him getting backstabbed by Adar and then all of them going and stabbing him. And then at the end of the story of this, we have Sauron backstabbing Adar and all the orcs stabbing Adar. So
I love a good parallelism. I'm not going to lie. That was pretty neat.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so let's move on to our next storyline with the Harfoots and the Stranger. So Jared, you give us a breakdown of that one?
Yeah, sure. So we start off with the Stranger, who is revealed to be Gandalf, meeting up with the Dark Wizard. And the Dark Wizard, contrary to what we've seen him before, suddenly portrays himself as more of a empathetic, kind figure. But that facade quickly fades away. And he pretty much destroys where the Stores live, and the Stores are led by Nori and Poppy to presumably start to migrate further west. And that does happen in canon. The Stores originally start off in the east and start to migrate at some point more to the River Anduin, where one day Smeagol will show up with his brother Deagle. And Gandalf eventually realizes that one day people are going to start calling him Gandalf. He finds his staff in the ruins of the Store Village, meets up with Tom Bombadil. They sing a little happy song. And then we end off with a kind of teasing, tantalizing view of the Dark Wizard back in his fortress of Carrascael. So lore inaccuracies versus accuracies. The Harfoots storyline is also probably one of the most controversial parts of the show. I personally don't mind the Harfoots. However, I will agree that Poppy and Nori, I enjoy them as characters, but I think their story has run its course, and I hope that there is a bit of a break now. I am very, very heavily invested in the wizards as well as the dwarves. Those are like the parts of Middle-earth that I'm very fervently obsessed with. So I hope that if this storyline does continue, it focuses more on Gandalf and the Dark Wizard in the future. As for lore inaccuracies, again, timeline compression is a thing. Here, Gandalf does not show up until the Third Age, when Sauron starts to return after being defeated, and he's mostly Leaf Shadow at that point. However, if we're going to go for lore accuracy, we have to talk about the Dark Wizard. The Dark Wizard is almost assuredly a blue wizard. So the showrunners have confirmed in an interview that he's not Saruman. Thank goodness. Because if that was going to be a whole other can of worms, if that was the case. So we know about Radagast in The Hobbit. We know about Saruman and Gandalf. The two blue wizards are a very nebulous thing in Tolkien. In one version of the story, they become dark wizards and find a magical cult that worship Morgoth. That's clearly what we've seen with this guy here. He's in the lands of Rune, which is where the blue wizards went to. And he's obviously started a magical cult with the Acolytes. And as a blue wizard, there's also another version where they're good. And they are sent into the east and south, so the Haradrim, and they do a lot of good stuff there. So a prevailing theory that I hope happens in the future is that they show another blue wizard and that he is like actually a good guy, and they kind of like bridge the two different stories that Tolkien wrote. I think that would be something very interesting to have Gandalf work with another wizard who is actually a good guy. As for like why the Dark Wizard isn't mentioned to be a blue wizard, that, from what I've heard, is actually a rights issue. The Tolkien estate is very particular about rights of anything from like the Unfinished Tales. So they literally may not have the ability to call him the Blue Wizard. Gandalf actually talking about the Blue Wizards in the Hobbit movies is a copyright infringement, and they almost got in legal trouble for that. Because Gandalf briefly mentions the Blue Wizards in the first Hobbit movie, and that was actually a big no-no. But yeah, so I really hope that we get to see more of Rune, because I love everything about Rune. We don't get too many details about it in Tolkien's lore, but everything that we do see, I've always found really interesting. And I was kind of annoyed that we were focusing so much on the stores and not actually getting any more of Rune. Because like the Dark Wizard's henchmen who mentioned that they were once kings and are now these mercenary kind of guys, I was like, yes, let me see more of that. And then we didn't get to see more of that. So I hope that we get to see more of that storyline playing out in the future. I'm actually very glad that the Dark Wizard is a multi-season threat, or assumed to be one at this point, because I was kind of worried that they would try to wrap it all up in this episode, and I don't think that would have done the story justice. So I hope we get to see more of that in the future. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say on that. If anyone wants to add anything or ask anything.
Yeah, so Mark, I remember you talking about how, like, from one previous episode, how we don't need to explain every single thing, and you don't really care about how Gandalf got his name.
Yes, I really don't. Like, you don't need to tell me every little thing about every little character. And yeah, I was finding out that it was Gandalf. Is like, okay, whoop-de-doo. Like, everyone started calling great. I don't know. That was so silly to me. And that was like, I kind of hate that they made him Gandalf. They should have made him like a blue wizard, or just like a wizard, right? We don't need to mention blue wizards if there's copyright issues. But we don't need to like have throw every bit of recognizable IP at a single show and like try to condense it as much as possible. So that's like my thing against like having Gandalf as the character. One small lore inaccuracy is also that Gandalf actually never goes to Rune. He only travels he never travels in the East. He says that specifically because the blue wizards traveled in the East. But yeah, so I think my lore inaccuracy of that timeline was that, like, just, I don't need you to explain everything about Gandalf to me. That's not really lore inaccuracy. That's just my pet peeve. My favorite part of that storyline, though, was the ending where it's Gandalf and Tom Bombadil sitting together singing quietly, and Tom Bombadil and Gandalf spend a lot of time together in the books, not like in the story, but it's like Gandalf actually goes to many years and spends time with Tom Bombadil. And that little moment of them singing together quietly was like, hey, feels like it's a book moment coming to life. So that was my favorite part of that storyline.
Wow. I'm surprised, because Mark was so agitated about Tom Bombadil.
Well, I also don't like the way they introduced Tom Bombadil. I actually like this whole storyline is like they could have cut it, but for what it was, like that little moment at the end, I was like, it's okay, it's good.
Yeah, I still stand by what I said when I was on previously on this podcast. I feel like the Harfoot and Stranger storyline should be its own miniseries. It does not need to be a part of the show. It's like they related it because the Dark Wizard knows of Sauron, and that's about it. Like, that's it.
I think the only big tie-in for this storyline is that one day Círdan the Shipwright gives his ring to Gandalf. That is kind of the only fully bridging point of the story that I can see them doing in the future.
That's a good point. A show called Rings of Power will be like Gandalf getting the Ring of Power, right? Is like what they're leading towards. Yeah,
I feel like that's the only like reason that it like ties it into the larger story overall, though.
Yeah. So that is another thing we can talk about now. Is the way like they had at least the two rings working in this episode, and it seemed like they're both providing like healing capabilities. And I think, I can't remember who had mentioned it before. Maybe it was Mark. It's just like saying like, it just like increases your power, or like what you can do. So I don't know if it was just like, if like you guys thought like this was like accurate for the rings to just be like healing, to help heal like Galadriel, but
yeah. So I actually have a quote from Fellowship of the Ring on that Elrond says at the Council of Elrond. He specifically says about the 3 elven rings, they were not made as weapons of war or conquest. That is not their power. Those who made them did not desire strength or domination or hoarded wealth, but understanding, making, and healing, to preserve all things unstained. It would have been better if the 3 had never been. So that, I feel like that was kind of interesting, like you're bringing in Elrond's hesitancy into the story, but also like I enjoy the Hobbit films to an extent, but one of the things that I hated was that Galadriel used her ring to tear apart an orc in the one scene of the movie. That infuriated me, because that is like the absolute antithesis of what the rings are supposed to do. Like, yes, the rings protect, but they don't, tear things apart. Their thing is literally healing and building. So actually seeing Elrond and Gil-galad healing Galadriel doing that, I really enjoyed that. I thought that was like a good nod to the power of the rings, as they're meant to work for the elves.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, I've talked a lot about on the show that like I don't like how they portrayed magic in the Rings of Power, because Middle Earth is a very magical world, and so the way the show has done it is like, hey, they created these rings and now they're like these magical MacGuffins that like do magical things, rather than it being like, oh, this is a magical world and these are like the pinnacle of the magical world, these items. I think particularly of like scenes from Peter Jackson's trilogy, which I think do really well, of like, you know, Gandalf with Bilbo in that one scene where he makes all the candles flare down, but like power is like a part of who people are, and it's not like little spells they cast. So that moment when like Galadriel just like automatically heals the guy who got shot by an arrow was like, wow, like, yes, the rings are for healing, but Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring uses, right, his ring to heal Frodo's wound. And it takes like months, right? It's not like a magical switch or something or a magical spell. There are these things that amplify the healing abilities that the elves already possessed and just make them more powerful. So yeah, I think it's really hard to portray magic in the way that Peter Jackson's trilogy did. And it's hard to portray a soft magic system. But I think that's really what the show really needed, and to do a better job of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because like Tolkien is famous for being one of the best people ever to do soft magic systems in his stories. Like it's so hard to do that well, and Tolkien just does it brilliantly. And as much as I love Rings of Power, it can't decide if it wants to do a soft or hard magic system. It just can't decide. I think they try to do soft magic a bit with the rings, but like they keep not doing that. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
The like unseen world in Tolkien's, like, because that's a big part of the show, is like the unseen world. Like Galadriel exists in the unseen world because she was in Valinor. Like that's like not like it's totally strange, right? The Maiar exist in the unseen world, and it's like it's made like a lot of these things just MacGuffins to use and throw around of like, oh, Sauron's gonna get this power and then he's gonna be able to do anything, and that's not how Tolkien's lore portrays them. I think your point was excellent. They don't know whether they want to do hard magic or soft magic system.
All right. Well, our next storyline now is the Numenor. So, Mark, you want to give us a breakdown of that one?
Yeah, sounds good. So Numenor is a little bit of a shorter storyline. They gather all the faithful into one room. Arthur is on as like, you guys are all traitors because Miriel survived the test of the Valar by using the help of Sauron. And we don't know, he hands the guy a paper. We don't know what the paper says, but he uses it as pretext to round up all the faithful. And Elendil's daughter, I don't remember her name because she's not really that important. Eregion, thank you. She switches sides and she goes to save her dad. And her dad then goes to Queen Miriel and like, let's get away. And then Queen Miriel's like, no, my place is here. You need to go. And she hands him the sword, whose name is escaping me for just a second. Narsil, thank you. Narsil, and he draws Narsil just like Aragorn does, and it's really cool. And then he rides off to go towards find his son Anarion in the west of Numenor. So yeah, that's how that season goes. And I think this part of the storyline, well, like clearly like Numenor has this sort of storyline where the faithful versus the king's men. There's a lot of political backstabbing. And at the end, it does get like, you know, outright war and massacre. This seems like maybe this is what we're talking about, timeline compressions, but this seems a little bit too close. Like there was a lot of, like there were literally hundreds of years in Numenor where the king's men and the faithful were using political intrigue and sort of, you know, vying for political power. It's only at the end when Sauron comes that Sauron really turns Numenor into open war against each other. And it seems like that's already happening. So this is a little bit too quick. I don't know. I really love the Numenor storyline. I love the three actors that they chose for Ar-Pharazôn, Elendil, and Queen Miriel. They're three of the best actors, I think, in the show. They're exactly like how I pictured Tolkien's characters. And it's really bringing it to life. And I just wish we got more time to spend on these, like this Numenor. And I really hope they give us that in the rest of the show, because it seems like it's already like things are hitting the fan, so to speak, in Numenor. And it needs to take its more time, I think. My favorite lore accuracy moment was the Elendil getting Narsil. That was like the really coolest moment.
Yeah.
Drawing it. And it's like, it's very fitting for like where the moment is at. I hate when they do like lore moments, but then they just like cheat things like, oh, I don't need to know how Gandalf got his name. But it's like, hey, this really cool moment of like, it makes sense that she's giving him the sword this time and how it's going to play an important role in the rest of the story. So yeah.
Yeah. So Jared, they're going for Anarion now.
I know. So I talked to Philip about this in a previous episode. I really want Anarion to appear in the story. Like I've like wanted him in it. So the fact that they name dropped him and now he's apparently going to be a big figure next season, I'm very glad about. I think that's having him out of the story for this long has been like kind of weird. So I'm really glad that he's like jumping in. Yeah, no, I as someone who wasn't the biggest fan of anything Numenor in the first season, every single scene of Numenor this season has been like a banger. Like the Trial of the Abyss, like the Great Eagle showing up. Like I've enjoyed so many things about Numenor. So I am like really excited and really hopeful that they're going to continue making it good. But I also I totally get what you're saying, Mark, about the timeline compression, because you're right. Like the outright warfare or labeling the faithful as rebels doesn't start until Sauron shows up. So I'm interested to see if the fall of Numenor is happening next season or if it's going to be like in season 4. Did you guys hear about the news about the writers for season 3? Okay, so they're getting a whole new team of writers. They're replacing 3/4 of the team, and a lot of the new writers have written Coronation Street and The Crown. So there's a lot of political TV show writers that are being brought on. So I'm really hoping that with the Dwarven Civil War starting to possibly happen, and with Numenor, all that kind of stuff, I hope that they really lean into the politics of that. So I don't know.
I forgot to mention that the reason that it seems like Ar-Pharazôn knows that Sauron helped Queen Muriel is that he seems to have had a vision through the Palantir that Halbrand is Sauron. How he explained that through a piece of paper and why everybody's just buying that piece of paper is not explained. I was going to say, part of the timeline compression is that things in Numenor, they're literally it's a flip of a coin, right? It's oh, the eagle shows up. It's for Ar-Pharazôn. Oh, Queen Muriel survives the trial. It's Queen Muriel. And it's this handful of 20 people in the crowd. This isn't a lore thing, but it's production. You got to make it feel like it's a massive amount of people in this city, that this is a force to be reckoned with. And that things don't switch off of the simplest symbols showing up, right? I don't know. But overall, the big beats of the story moments have been great.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Maverick, overall, and the show kind of passing through moments and, maybe not, a lot of people say oh, this seems really odd, or that wouldn't make sense, in real life.
I mean, to be honest, and kind of going off of what Mark said, is that I think is exactly the problem with the Numenor plotline. And unlike what you guys have been saying, I actually hate the Numenor plotline. This one just drives me bananas. No, other than Eregion or whatever, the Black Elf, he's peak guy I dislike. Right underneath that is Numenor right now, and that's just because the beats on it are so stock and predictable at this point that you don't have any suspension of belief about what's going to happen or if anyone's actually in concern, right? Especially Kemen, Pharazôn's son, is driving a plot line that you could see coming for 2,000 miles. You have no doubt about what the bad guys are going to do next, and frankly, what the good guys are going to do next, because you know that Muriel is going to say, oh no, I can't go with you. I will stay here as a sacrifice. And you go, why? You're not going to do anything except for literally die or be put in jail because maybe they need you for something for later in the story. But the real bad guys wouldn't actually do that. So it's
alert, they do need her for something later in the story.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's
so
very unfortunate.
yeah, exactly. So, it's I think there was things about it that I thought were very interesting. And when Numenor first showed up, just as an audience, knowing a little bit about it, I was like, okay, this is going to be awesome, super excited. And I just really haven't seen that play out in the second season specifically, right? And some of that we'll talk later about with the themes and what they're trying to portray with these characters. But it was a lot of time of things that you saw happening, going to happen, and then happening. And then you go, okay, let's move on. So I think that if you're going to build a compelling storyline here, you have to have some question about how it's going to turn out. And when you know that Muriel is going to survive when she's being walked down into the water, you as the audience aren't going to be engaged in it as if versus in a situation where you actually think she might die. That's just one of many examples where, Elendil gets captured because he started an insurrection and you're like, oh my goodness, is he going to escape? Spoiler alert, he does. Did we see that coming? Yes. That kind of stuff just can't be happening if you want the audience to believe genuinely that the good guys are facing a serious obstacle.
Yeah, I think what would also help is you kind of mentioned in the story, like there's a lot of political intrigue that goes back and forth between the Kingsmen and the Faithful. Whereas I feel like, at least especially in season 2, what all we've seen is like the Kingsmen are all like just going after the Faithful and trying to get rid of them and trying to undercut them and everything else. And it just seems like the Faithful are just kind of like letting things happen, which is like not how it's supposed to be. So I think that would also make it different of being like, hey, they're actually like, you're showing a scene of like them like actually like pushing back or something else, or like you know doing something or something else. Like I would, it would be interesting to be like, hey, when they had all the who's the Navy, the coast, I forget what the Coast Guard people are called, the Helendale Guard leads.
Oh, the Sea Guard.
Sea Guard, yes.
Yeah, the Sea Guard.
Yeah, so like something like that. Like, okay, hey, all the Sea Guards stop, and then like, hey, somehow the Faithful convince like also like all the merchants to stop working. And then it's like, then the Kingsmen have to like back off from that because like, they're not getting, like, nobody's supplying them with stuff, or like, something like that, But no, we don't see anything. Like the Faithful just basically are like the punching bag, and we don't see them throw any punches back, which is not how it's supposed to be. So,
Well, I think the thing is too, is that they like this could be spread out over so many more seasons if they really wanted to. Kind of like what you're saying, it seems like they're just rushing over things and not really giving much of an explanation for why they're happening. And if they would, and even like following the lore a little bit more too, they could be making a ton more like seasons, I think.
You could make an entire show off of Numenor, right?
Yeah, so that's the thing I hope that kind of comes into play next season. That's why I'm glad that Elendil is going into the west with Anarion, because the city in the west of Numenor is called Andúnie, which is a haven for the faithful historically in Numenor. Not by the end, but historically it's a haven. And I hope, here's the thing, is that I don't know if they are just rushing towards the fall of Numenor when, Sauron comes onto Numenor and just messes everything up. I don't know if that's going to be next season, or if that's going to be season 4, if that's going to be like the main focus of season 4. Because you have to have, a season at the end for them finding Gondor in the War of the Last Alliance. If it's season 4, then season 3 needs to slow things down. It needs to pump the brakes a little bit. And I hope that's kind of like they're going to lead more into like the political stuff and like kind of have that, like that chess game that you guys were talking about. I hope that comes into play if they go that route. If they're going to put in the fall of Numenor next season, a little rushed, but okay. Like, I get why you're rushing it a bit then. But, yeah.
I have a hot take about this storyline, but it has to do with, like, the difference between the lore and, like, the worldviews of the people who are making this show. So we should come back to it whenever we touch on that.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. So, for I believe the final storyline, we got Isildur and his girlfriend, and we got like Leggear there too. So, Mark, would you give us the breakdown of that?
Sure. This one's pretty short. We see Isildur getting ready to leave because a ship from Numenor has arrived, and he has a nice bonding moment with Theo, whose mother died, and about their mothers passing away. And then he meets up with his girlfriend, whatever you'd like to call her, and they share a parting romantic kiss. And then he goes, and Kevin, the guy who saved his life in the first season, or he saved Kevin's life and his Airfire's own son, and finds out very quickly that things are sort of hitting the fan in Numenor, and he's able to go back, but he's only able to go back himself. Also, we get some fun parts of Numenor playing like an imperial role that's very much in the lore, where Numenor starts, going to certain coastal lands and start setting up themselves as an empire. And therefore you see that where they're like becoming more authoritarian with their relationship with the men of that location. So that's like, I think, pretty lore accurate. I mean, I kind of hate Kevin as a character, so I don't know if that's like a lore inaccuracy, but maybe we'll just throw it on for kicks and giggles. But yeah.
Yeah, if you're actually going to go by timeline compression, this is actually the more accurate one versus the Numenor one, because like Mark said, Numenor starts to become really imperialistic, and it doesn't go well for anyone involved.
They also are gonna like chop down the trees, which seems like it's gonna be like a thing where the Ents are gonna like that's gonna be a future storyline as well. So
Yeah, it just like kind of goes back to like what I think could have been done better in the show is instead of cutting short and like restricting these stories about like the Ents, where if you go back to the episode where we had the like the Barrel Whites too, like I bet you're not gonna see the Barrel Whites again in the rest of the show, and just kind of like in a way it's kind of like a bummer because it's like they've never been like shown before. And it's like the Ent wife has never been shown before too. But instead of like focusing more on these like cool moments that they could flesh out and like describe more and I think get people more interested in, they kind of cut them short. Like we got like five different storylines in this episode. And it's like we probably only needed two of them to really make it an interesting story.
Yeah, so with the Entwives, I'm almost positive that they'll be coming back because the Entwives disappeared during the War of the Last Alliance. A lot of them are presumably destroyed by Sauron, and maybe a few flee into the lands of Rhûn. So hopefully we see that. I would be really disappointed if we didn't, because they have at least set that up. So I hope that kind of shows up. Another real like random kind of thing that I just wanted to throw in there that I am really interested if they're going to show is that 3 of the Rings of Men are given to Numenorians, specifically ones who are starting to take over Middle Earth. So I am really interested to see if that plays anything in the show, if any of like the rings find their way back to Numenor or anything. I'd be interested to see.
Kevin is the Witch King.
Oh, dude, but you see, I unfortunately though too, I think Theo is gonna be one.
Actually, I would really like Theo being one if they tied in Arondir with being like, because with Theo's mother's passing, he doesn't really have a guiding light. So if that becomes Arondir's role, because like Tolkien does say that some of the 9 who got the rings were originally good men, but because of like deluding phantoms and visions sent by Sauron and the eventual like corruption of the rings, they all turn into ring race and they all turn soulless, horrible monsters in the end. So having Theo actually get a ring, especially with him being so tempted by darkness in the first season, would I think be a good tragic story. That would like be great if like season 3 would explore that. That's my personal hope, but
Yeah. The other thing I was gonna throw out is like because Isildur and Theo both had like lost their mothers and bonded over that, and Isildur will be tempted by the One Ring and not be able to resist its power. So this that the insecurity of people who have these tragic backstories and feel like they need to prove something to resist power is maybe a theme the show is trying to portray in the future as well.
All right, so I think we kind of did a pretty good job of going over this 8th episode and giving a good breakdown of each storyline, talking about lore accuracies and inaccuracies. So I think I kind of shared like what I think overall, Rex, the bigger things for me was just rushing stories in general for this season. I think I had to get each of you guys like opinions on like which season you liked better, and then tying back to I guess especially for like some of us who maybe know the lore a little bit more, there is definitely points that we can look at in the show and then compare them to the books and talk about how like these differences show like Amazon's like taking this a different direction with their worldview. Maybe they don't want to take Tolkien's direction for different reasons. Maybe it's Amazon wanting to just sell the show and like make their own thing, and they don't care about so much of the product. So I guess Maverick, did you think that this season was trash?
No, I did not. I was not expecting that. I think, especially when you're looking at worldview, right? It's very It's very difficult to say definitively what the worldview is when the story's not over, right? And so some of the thing is that you can have themes and messages, but until that message terminates, you don't know for sure what they're trying to tell you. And so you can have hints of ideas, themes of ideas that are going on, and they're interesting to explore. And as you see those developed, you get more of a nuanced view, right? And so there is some things that you see further developed in the story that I appreciated. And generally, I would say that the storylines I appreciated more are ones that had greater development, right? And that goes, some of that goes back to the inherent value of like a TV show versus a movie, right? Because a movie is like self-contained idea of start to finish generally, and you have the whole story with the themes and the messages portrayed in a single box, if you will, versus in a show you have 20-minute to 60-minute segments that build on each other until you have the ending arc. And in this, you don't even have the ending arc because you're going to have 3, 4, 5 seasons of this until you get that ending arc. So it is a little bit hard to say, but because of that, you should have the themes and ideas developed more, right? And that's why I think they're important. A little bit of just like a side tangent, but I think this is relevant to understand how I think about these stories, is that usually when you have longer storylines to tell a story, you have characters embodying different ideals, and they develop those themes more in that. And that's valuable because we as audiences can relate to them better, right? You can't relate to walking through Mordor holding a ring on your chest as you're trying to throw it into Mount Doom, but you can relate to perseverance and having to push through hard times and things like that. And so the themes help to develop characters and also relate them back to us so that we as audiences can understand them better and appreciate them. And so my bigger problems with the storylines that don't progress, I would say, are there because themes aren't developed, right? Especially like the Numenor plotline. You have themes of, for example, especially with Elendil, loyalty and family from like the father's perspective. How do you deal with family relationships as a father, and how do you stay loyal in the midst of um challenges? The problem with this entire season is that of those two themes that you have explored by Elendil, you don't see the family one develop because he's not seeing his son at all, right? And two, you don't see loyalty developed any more than it already has. We already see established at the end of season 1 that he is completely loyal to Muriel. He's not going to betray her. He's going to stand by her side no matter what. And so when you see these themes challenged, you don't see any growth, any ideas, new challenges around them, and they can come in many different forms, but you don't see anything new in that thread. And so as a result, you don't see him develop as a character, and we don't relate to him anymore and see any more nuance in that. So there's some of those kinds of things that I have as a problem. I can give more examples if you want, but I think that's kind of the jumping point that I come from. Yeah.
Yeah, so Mark, if you think there was one thing the show could have done better, what would you say?
One thing, I'm gonna be honest, I would say like cut out an entire storyline, probably the Harfoots and the Stranger, and just double down on your other storylines that are better. That's just my hot take. But honestly, like I think Numenor, I mean Maverick had like sort of a negative view of that, but I still think that's the best storyline and that you could spend a lot more time there. Yeah, I think also I particularly loved I think in Numenor you get like the clearest picture of Tolkien's lore and some of Tolkien's ideals as well, like what it means to be faithful. And Elendil's like, I'm going to be faithful no matter the cost, even if it means not fighting back, even if it means watching my friends die, even if it means going to my own death, I'm going to be faithful, was a theme that was played out this season, I think. But yeah, I think that would be my like only way of changing this season to make it to be a lot better. I think it's because of the first season, the show has already sown the seeds, and a lot of the lore problems are already like deeply interwoven with the story we know. So it's really hard to change anything superficially to make it better.
What about you, Jared?
What would I like do to change it or make it better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of agree with just picking certain storylines and developing those more instead of bouncing around. I think the finale actually did like a decent job of bouncing around between the 5 storylines, but it shouldn't have been 5 storylines in the first place. Like bouncing around between 5 different storylines in a single episode is very hard. Why would you make it harder for yourself to begin with. Yeah, I think that overall, I'm really, really loving the show. I'm really enjoying the show, but I think that it just needs to take its time with things a bit more, because like when it actually slows down and takes its time and really delves deep, that's where it shines. Like the Celebrimbor and Sauron storyline this season is a perfect example of that. Like in theory, it should be the most boring part of the show because it's two guys in a room talking, but it ended up being like one of the most captivating parts. Like anytime those two were on screen together, my eyes were like glued to the TV screen. So yeah, I just think taking its time, developing certain ones more. I pretty much agree with Mark. Yeah.
I was going to really quick mention that I thought even within storylines, the show is like speedrunning references. There was this one episode I remember where it was like Barrow White's Ents and like a bunch of other things were thrown in, and then they had this random like worm show up and swallow Arondir and Isildur. That was like episode 5, I think. But it was like, we could have taken all of this time and given it to the Ents and have this like cool moment between Arondir and the Ents, rather than like having to reference a bunch of small things, like tie in bigger parts of Tolkien's worldview more deeply into your story rather than just referencing them quickly.
What about you, Nathan? Anything to improve?
Yeah, I think just as I stated on my thing, I think just if you want to continue the Harfoots and Stranger storylines, make it its miniseries. Keep it out of the main show. Just make it its miniseries. Like the actors in those, like I don't have a problem with the actors and everything else. Like I find it, like if that was just a show by itself, and it's like, okay, this is a 5-episode run. We're just going to talk about the Stranger in this one and talk about Ruin and all that other stuff. I'd be like, cool, that's awesome. Do that. It does not need to be a part of the Rings of Power series. They are shoehorning the connections in so hard because they wanted to talk about Gandalf and the Hobbits, and it's like, okay. So, but what I think they definitely should do is they should really, what I hope they would change is like, I really appreciate, especially with the dwarf storyline, is like showing how the ring changes the people. Like seeing how Durin the Third got changed when he put on the ring and everything else, and how the greed of the dwarves got infected and everything else. Like I hope in season 3, because I'm going to assume that Sauron's going to pass up the 9. Like watching the downfall of the 9 and how they get corrupted. That's what I really am looking forward to, because I think that the kind of like the corruption of Celebrimbor, like where like Sauron like manipulates him and like gets him to, like in the start where he writes the letter to lie to Gil-galad and everything else and all the other stuff, and like that kind of stuff of like watching Sauron being the great manipulator. That was awesome, because like seeing the interaction between him and Celebrimbor, like obviously I hope obviously he's going to Numenor because we know that's in the books. Like just watching like this season of like him and how he like absolutely like mentally destroyed Celebrimbor. Like the reason for that, like I can see why he would go to Numenor and basically take over it from prison. Is because he did it in season 2. He's going to do it in whatever season next it is. So it's just, he's basically Eregion was the trial run. So, but yeah, I think just they need to really, I think they're just trying to throw in like Easter eggs for the sake of Easter eggs, which I don't think you need to do. Just stick to your story. I mean, at this point, I think hopefully they've done enough that they don't need to like throw in Easter eggs for the sake of Easter eggs. So like just focus on the stories that are good and make the Harfoots a miniseries.
Yeah, if I can like build on that for a second. So the second age of Tolkien, the lore is just one of consistent tragedy. It's one tragedy after another, and every single like kingdom that's built, another 3 are just torn down. And I think that like my personal theory about that is like this era of Tolkien's lore is very Shakespearean. And so I think that the show should kind of like lean into that in a sense of like, because Shakespeare was the master of tragedy. I'm saying this as like an English major, sorry. But like Shakespeare was like the master of tragedy. And so just kind of leaning into that a lot and just delving deep into characters' psyches, especially like I sincerely hope that the manipulation of the 9 with the rings is a huge part next season. I think there's rich storytelling possibility there and character work there. And I really hope it goes somewhere with that, because that kind of just really fits in with the idea of like tragedy being a running theme throughout this age.
One thing I really kind of stuck out to me in this episode, especially, also, I mean, this is kind of completely different from what we were talking about, but I think to like a certain extent, like kind of almost ironically, it's been to the hurt of the show to try to tie you back to the trilogy movies. And they've done that in a lot of ways of requoting. They did that by, with Galadriel getting stabbed and then them healing her. I think they did that also with some other things. They didn't necessarily like drag it out long, but it was the way, that's true. It was the way that it was the way this could be completely like off the wall, just like I'm the only person in the world who thought this when this happened. But whenever Theo came in and hugged Isildur gave him this kind of like slow, like kind of pat almost. It reminded me, and maybe this is just odd, but it reminded me of the same hug that Aragorn gave Haldir at Helm's Deep. And to me, it was just like, are they really just like trying to play that? Because because Haldir kind of like just kind of stands there as Aragorn hugs him. So it was like to me, maybe it's kind of like the dumbest thing in the world, but there are some other things as well that it seemed like they're, for instance, like, I've read the Silmarillion. Like Jared's saying, it's like depressing, it's like something completely new. It's like to compare it to like the Lord of the Rings is like almost a disservice in a way. It's like, it's a different kind of storytelling in a big way, in my opinion. So like to be trying to like really like bring it back to Lord of the Rings, I don't know. To me, like whenever I went into watching, it was kind of like, hey, I want to see something different. I want to see something about like the Silmarillion that we haven't seen. Like it wasn't so much of I want it to be like at the same level compared to like the trilogy. Like I feel like that was just them. I think they were trying to do that to a certain extent, and it's like, well, that's missing the point of like why you're making something on Middle Earth.
The show has had a lot of verbal references and like visual callbacks to the movies in a lot of different ways. I think often they're used very cheaply and poorly. I thought like the Narsil drawing in this last episode was like one of the good ones, but oftentimes they're just sort of shoehorned in there and to the detriment of the show. I think I would say that as well, Phil.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, between this story and Lord of the Rings, there are threads, and there are, Tolkien used parallelism in his writing often. But the thing is that the more references you have, the less impact that they're going to have. So if you're going to have a reference to the Lord of the Rings, either movies or stories, like make it count. And I think like make it impactful instead of just having a lot of different ones.
Right, because at that point it becomes a reference for the sake of a reference rather than having a tangible, valuable impact on the story that we're watching right now. Yeah. Also, as a side, actually, keep going, guys. I have a question for Mark after we're done with this, but like for now, sorry, I don't want to interrupt this train of thought.
Shoot.
Well, I've just been thinking this entire time. You were talking about Halbrand and how you didn't like him. What were your thoughts on Anatar, especially now that his arc is fully manifested in this season? Like, do you like that manifestation of Sauron or not?
Yes, for sure. So like the thing I hated about Halbrand was like and maybe this is like a difference. You talked a lot about like expectation subversion with Numenor. You feel like you can just call everything from a mile away. And I think expectation subversion is important in a lot of stories, but some stories are good. Like, even if I see it coming, it's like, wow, if you execute it very well. I think that's really a lot of Tolkien stories are like have a ton of foreshadowing, right? Frodo's going to end up at Mount Doom and throw the ring in the fire, right? We knew that from the very first moments of the first movie. But like, it's like, hey, I like seeing the way it gets there. And it's epic how it gets there. And the whole like Halbrand thing of like trying to guess who Sauron was and then like having some subtle moments. But then he saved Galadriel in the first episode. And you're like, why is Sauron floating in the middle of the ocean? And I still don't know that after seeing that flashback of why he was floating in the middle of the ocean. Like, I get it, bad the shipwreck, but why was he on the ship? It was like so confusing and it's so convoluted. But like Anatar is like, hey, I know why he's there. I know he's Sauron. I know he's there to manipulate. And it's really cool seeing how he manipulates Celebrimbor and how he accomplishes his ends. And he's the bad guy. And I know who the bad guy is, right? Like, so much better than seeing Halbrand the first episode or first season is seeing Anatar as Sauron in the second season.
And that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about in season 1, it seemed like lucky happenstance for a lot of things that happened to him, versus in this one, he's a little more scheming and developing things. And like, there is a very clear intention behind everything that he does.
For sure. I would say that in this season as well. So, like, one, the messengers that Elrond sends, or sorry, that Gil-galad sends are somehow mysteriously killed. It's not clear if Sauron has anything to do with that. Then their, like, way is blocked by the bridge getting blown out. It's not clear if Sauron has anything to do with that. Then the dwarves are suddenly, like, desperate for, because their, like, minds are, like, all darkness, and it's unclear if Sauron had anything to do with that. There's a lot of these happenstances that happen this season that you're like, I don't see how Sauron was connected with that, and would have loved like a season where like, or a moment where Sauron like sends a spell out that like somehow makes the mountain go dark for the dwarves, something like that. But it just was like, oh, Middle Earth is like somehow is like turning against all the good characters, and they're playing into Sauron's hand because of it. Was like not maybe. I guess I would have liked to see like Sauron pulling some magical strings even to sort of be orchestrating some of these events and not just having storms knock out bridges for lucky chances. But yeah,
Right.
Yeah, the my favorite parts, once again going into the Celebrimbor and Sauron part, was like just all the magic that Sauron used to trap Celebrimbor in his prison, and also like the ways he used to manipulate other elves to like convince them that Celebrimbor was crazy. Like the one scene where he comes out for the first time, and he's like, this is Sauron, Anatar Sauron. They're all like, he's been organizing our defenses, he's been keeping us safe, and then he grabs, I forget what her name is, but Mirdonia. Yeah. He grabs her like, you have to believe me, and he flips his hand and like forces him to like throw her over the edge as like proof, like, yeah, no, Celebrimbor's lost it. I did nothing. Smile. and it's like that kind of stuff was like, okay, that's good. More of that, please.
Yeah, how Sauron first appeared as Anatar as well was like the perfect, I think, of a soft magic system. Is like, right, he appears in the clouds and stuff, and it's like Sauron trying to appear as good as possible. Sort of like, I love that, like, because that's like what a soft magic system is. It's about who the person is and the effect they have on their like surroundings. But yeah. All right, can I have my spicy political take on Numenor?
Go.
Yes. Okay, here it goes, guys. I think the reason that they're rushing things, the Numenor storyline, to political violence is because of certain political events happening in the United States. That's my theory. In the first season, you had like Ar-Pharazôn give a speech about like, the elves are going to come and take our jobs. And you're like, clearly this has like vibes for real life. And in the second season, there's no such thing as like tensions in societies that we can live with anymore. It's like all or nothing. And I think that's actually a political view of the show that's sort of like coming in, and where Tolkien's lore played like there was these tensions in Numenorean society that took place over generations. The show is rushing it because it doesn't think it's believable to have serious political tensions in a city like Numenor. That's my hot, spicy take.
Okay. Yeah. So, all right, Mark, because you're like the only person who's talked about like not watching like the next season, what's your take now?
So this season, I said if this season was as like the first season or worse, I would not watch it. This season was almost unquestionably better, and so I will watch the next season.
See, like it's all right. So I have really tried hard not to go to YouTube and watch reviews. There are a couple of guys I respect on it. A couple of guys I respect because they really try to give it like a straight up like, hey, this is what's up. One of them is Nerd of the Rings. I haven't seen all of them, but like the guy obviously just giving you like, hey, this is it, and like this is what I don't like, but like these are some good things. And like some others are just like, bro, like I can't stand this, and this is my last review of this show. And it's just interesting is like you get a lot of people talking to you about how like the reviews are really low and a lot of other things. I don't know, like you guys give me your take about this too, but it's never seemed to me that I have seen it across the board, like everybody likes it or everybody hates it, you know? It's very much like I'll probably send out another poll on this after this. Is that like, 'cause like I did it last year and like it was a 50-50 split, as close as I could get to just fans on the show. It was a 50-50 split on who liked it and who didn't. But you heard more about people not liking it than you did. Like you hear people say, "Oh, the reviews are down," and it's like, and like the views on this show apparently on this season were like lower. And it's kind of like it's just interesting because it's like I don't know. I get it. Like that might be the case, but at the same time, I'm like, maybe it's just because I gave this thing more of a chance that I liked it more than the first season. So the fact that like people talk about it like getting worse, like less views, is it's just kind of like to me, it's kind of I don't know. And I have been like hard on it, and I've liked things and like not like things. So, anyways, but
Yeah. So if I can comment on that, the just like the about the fan reactions to this season and also just to the show in general. I have like between my family and my friends, it's fairly evenly split. I have half my family and friends either tried to watch the show or refused to watch the show on principle, and then the other half like watch it and enjoy it. And so like I also, this is, you know, obviously my own stupid fault. I went on Reddit, which is so dumb of me, and started, you know, like just, you know, kind of engaging with like other fans of the show. And I will admit, like, I understand that people don't like the show, but people seriously cross a line, like when it comes to their hatred of the show. And that kind of just like makes me instinctively like just defend it. And like sometimes I feel like I can't criticize the show without just like making myself automatically seem like I'm one of like the people who absolutely hate it with everything in their guts. Like there was like a Reddit post where it was like, just please explain to me what you like about the show. And so I wrote this like response of the things I like, and I have like screenshots of the responses I got to my post, and they are: loser, Amazon Prime ad, are you paid to say this? History will not look kindly on you people, and it's hard for me to call you a fan. It really is. I didn't like try to call anyone out. I literally only listed the reasons I liked this show. That was it. And like I wasn't trying to start a fight or anything. And that's like the immediate responses I got. Like I totally, because again, I have family and friends who hate this show, and I get it. Like I understand why you don't, but like the vitriol around this show is like so insane. Yeah, that's just like my 2 cents on it though.
I guess for me, so I'll come from my perspective because mine's probably a bit unique. Like I still have not watched season 1. I got the summary from you guys, this podcast, and other people, you know, not necessarily on the podcast, but also like discussions and other stuff.
Yeah.
So for me, at least, like I did not have the experience of season 1 of being like, oh, I'm expecting a pseudo accurate kind of Lord of the Rings show, kind of like the movies, or they'll take some liberties, but mostly they'll try to follow books and everything else. To suddenly being like, oh no, they're making their own timeline. And so then when I was coming into season 2 to watch it, because like just to kind of see it, I came in understanding like, okay, this is Amazon's timeline. They're basically, as I was talking with another friend, he was basically like, it's like, so basically you're just reading this as like a good Lord of the Rings fan fiction. I'm like, yeah, pretty much. And so I was basically grading on like, how well do I just enjoy this fantasy show? And how much do I enjoy it because it's based off of Lord of the Rings, how much do I based off that? And that's where I was able to find like the enjoyment is like that part. But the parts where I know like this couldn't fit because this like it the big famous part was Elrond French kissing Galadriel. I was like, you two have separate partners that show up later in the story. Like how How he?
I mean, it's
Oh,
literally
if
his
I'm not
mother-in-law,
dealing-
right?
Like,
Yeah,
boom.
his grandmother.
No, it's his mother-in-law.
Mother-
Mother-in-law.
Gosh.
Yeah, no grandmother. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like I don't know, but it's so like coming from that, like I was able to enjoy it because it was like, okay, I know what I'm getting into, and I'm not like I understand that they are going to take liberties, and so that's why I said like with the Harfoot storyline, like I feel like the Harfoot story once again is like it's a good story if it's not connected to the Rings of Power. If it's just by itself, that would be, I think, the perfect place for it. It's just, it's tied in with everything else and it kind of drags everything else because it's this fifth storyline you have to dedicate time to because you have to dedicate time to this. You have to rush all the other ones. And so we, again, to the comments where like we've all been talking about, like they feel like they're rushing things because they have to get all the storylines in. And so I think if they just do some paring down, they can actually spend the appropriate time on their characters and storylines, and we won't just feel like, you know, it's the Cliff Notes version of the Rings of Power. It's instead like an actual like the good story. So
Yeah, just like one like final thing I'll just say on this, just from my perspective, is I really love this podcast. Like when I started listening to it, because like for you know, even if you guys don't like certain things, it never. I don't think. Look, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it never comes from a place of we want this to fail or like we want to hate this. It comes from like an even like from a blank page as much as possible, and it's like I did like this, I didn't like this, and here's the reasons why. And that's why like I really appreciate like this kind of discussion because like you can criticize and like also compliment at the same time, and you know it's I just appreciate that.
I was going to throw in my 2 cents on like the fan vitriol. I will say that I think one thing that's really important to remember is like, I don't know, I'm someone who's like a diehard fan. I think that this show has struggled in ways that have nothing to do with the lore. I think it's really hard for like real nerds is that they cover all their hatred of something in a language of like, oh, the lore is off or this is bad. But the show, like the action has let me down a lot in terms of like the fight choreography, the battle scenes of Eregion was like, especially like because it's the Lord of the Rings show, like the 3 Peter Jackson films, which, you know, have their own lore inaccuracies, but like they just don't compare favorably in some of those respects to the other thing is like the crowd sizes. Like this is the most like high budget thing ever, but like everything in Numenor is like 20 people in the crowd. And like, or like the battle scenes is like, oh, we have 10 elves around us, or we're like 3 elves. I don't know. And some of these things like really take me out of the show and like have nothing to do with the lore accuracy. And obviously like I'm not like a film producer or anything like that. So I'm not like qualified, but I think this show has like, well, has like its high moments. It's also like struggled in ways that have nothing to do with like lore issues. And so while we're like diehard fans and the diehard fans in the show might like be split on whether it's good or bad, people who aren't fans of Tolkien's lore, I think might have tons of issues with the show and not like it for that reason. So yeah.
I mean, I'd agree with that. I think that's kind of the perspective I come from. And that's part of exactly what you guys have been saying. Like, for one, a Game of Thrones budget does not automatically make this a good show, right? It's like you can have tons of action, but if the action isn't compelling, if the stories are rushed, if you have lack of development for characters, people aren't going to enjoy it and they're not going to watch it and they're not going to appreciate it. I think that they still have some good things and they don't do other good things, which is why you get that mixed bag review like you're getting with Jared, right? It's like it's not all great, but it's not all terrible either. And then you have split down the middle. Just in a broader context, which is the other thing that's been going through my mind this whole time, is that we live in a cinema universe, if you will, right now, where you see tons of content that are callbacks, right? And there's almost this idea in cinema today that callbacks are safe, right? You have the Spider-Man movies that are referencing old Spider-Man movies. You have all of the Disney remakes. You have the Joker origin stories. You know, you have all of this content that's referencing other stuff that was successful before and bringing it today. It seems like in some ways that's what you get in the broader context bringing into the Rings of Power, where they are making all of these references because they see that as this is what makes good cinema or this is what makes money. Because everyone wants to see something they've seen in the past that was successful and good. And so the reason you get all of this like lore dumping on us where it's like, oh, there's Narsil, and oh, there's this other thing, and oh, this place, the Barrow Downs, and all of the fans are supposed to be going crazy because all of these references are being made. But that, once again, doesn't make it a compelling story. So that even you like the reference, you don't like the reference, it doesn't mean that it's actually something that makes you sit on the edge of your seat, want to keep watching, and want to know what happens next. So, do I like references? Yeah, to a certain degree, but until we see that tangentially, or sorry, not directly affecting the plot, I'm not going to say that I respect the reference.
Yeah, so it's kind of final thought that I have on all of it is just more like worldview wise, is it's, it's a shame. I think one part is that Amazon's, producing the show out of like for their own benefit, not really respecting the source material very much. In a real sense, like not like in the spirit of Tolkien, right? You got Tolkien who pulled from his life circumstances and other things and mythology and poured into it in that sense. But it almost seems like Amazon's just using it in a way to get money or to produce their own agenda in some ways. But it's not 100% that way. They've done good, a lot of characters good. But is it 100% perfect? No. If it was Lord of the Rings, then that would be great in some ways. But no, but they definitely have I think they have also more of a challenge than people give them credit for, especially for, the rights that they have to get, right? And there are probably more loopholes they have to jump through. But so anyways, thanks everybody for coming and recording with me. This is a great group. Glad we were able to get everybody out here, and thanks Maverick for giving your 2 cents on the cinema side of things, and Jared and Mark for lore, and Jared for being able to come on. It was a good interaction, good meeting and
I'm the pretty face.
opportunity. But hey, Nate's done his part too. He's given good 2 cents as well. And yeah, it's been a lot of fun. But yeah, so thanks for everybody for tuning in to the White City podcast, and catch us for our later reviews on the show and other content that will be coming out for things about Middle Earth. Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. We're on YouTube or Facebook under the tag @The White City Podcast.